So I'll go ahead and get moving on this. It's 10 o'clock and we've got a good number of people already in here. So we'll just get started. Again, my name is Richard Fennell. I'm a visualization specialist here at Lexion. I've been here for a couple of months now, but I actually have a design background. So I've been using KeyShot now for a couple of years, basically, since it started in the days before KeyShot, when it was still HyperShot. So if you can see my screen, I'm going to be running today's demo on a Mac. And this isn't a huge rendering station or anything. I am running a MacBook Pro. It is a quad-core i7, so it's hyper-threaded and has 8 processors, basically, or 8 cores that it can take advantage of. But I don't have any super fancy hardware or anything, so this is all going to be a pretty good representation of how a lot of our customers are actually running. I'm going to go ahead and bring up KeyShot. Today, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be giving an overview of the textures that we can take advantage of. So I'll give a kind of a brief rundown on some of the basics on how to actually apply textures, the different types of textures and how they can be used, and some things that people don't necessarily aren't too familiar with. We'll go through that, just the basics there. We also get a lot of questions about material creation. So I'm going to show some tricks on how to get the best textures, whether we provide them or you create them or you take advantage of some resources online or through different applications. And then we'll go ahead and we'll actually paint up a couple of models, go through the scenes that way, and then we'll actually apply what we go over now in the beginning. All right, so first of all, I'm just going to get my Windows up and running. So I started this. As you can see, we're running KeyShot 4, so if you're not running on 4, I will be going over some things that are exclusive to KeyShot 4. Additionally, at the end, I'm going to be going over some features that will be coming out with KeyShot 4.1. So whenever we have that update, we're going to give a sneak peek of some of those new materials and things that we're going to have in the new version. But so if there's something that's going on that you may not necessarily understand why you don't have that button or you don't have that feature, it's probably because it's a KeyShot 4 feature. Okay, for example, my Windows here, we have the ability now to enable docking. So if I maximize my window, then it's going to have those windows docked on the side. All right, so let me pause this, and I'll just go ahead and give a quick overview. I'm going to move over to web browser and talk about some of the textures and where you can get textures today. So if you go to our website, keyshot.com, and then you go under the materials drop-down under resources, here we have some materials that you can take advantage of now. DuPont paints are one, but additionally we have Mold Tech textures where you can download their library of textures. And these are actually made to scale so that these are going to give you a realistic representation of what a part will look like in production. So if you don't know about Mold Tech textures, these are a great resource. We have a partnership with Mold Tech so that you can bring these into your models in KeyShot and give you an idea of what it'll actually look like coming out the mold. So I'll start here and I'll just get into this because we have gotten some questions on how to make the Mold Tech textures look the best. So I'm back here in my session in KeyShot. I pause that, so I'm going to unpause it. If you don't know, you can always pause your real-time view hitting Shift-P. Additionally, just one kind of quick tip, you can always hit the K key. That'll bring up all of your hotkeys. All right, so I'm going to go here. I'm going to import a model. So I've got a model ready to go. So this is just a model that was brought in, or excuse me, this model was created in Rhino. It's going to be really basic. It's just going to be a 5-inch cube. I'll go ahead and I'll bring this in. The reason I started with this cube is because since it's very basic, but what I can do is I know what software this was modeled in. So say you're working in SolidWorks or Creo or Creo, you define those materials or your model units, and we now respect that with KeyShot 4. So a question that we get when people start applying their Mold Tech textures, for example, is they're not exactly sure why the scale isn't coming in perfectly. What you actually have to do, you have to define your scale for the model that you're working with. So if I come here under the Edit menu, I have this selection here. I can set my model units. So this is really important. One, it'll It'll help you have your textures correctly if you're using, for example, the Multec textures. Additionally, it's important if you're going to be doing lighting in your scene. We're not going to get into lighting in this webinar, but if you're getting lighting that's really blown out or not powerful enough, odds are pretty good it has to do with the scale that you've selected or that you haven't selected for your scene. So I'm going to go ahead and pull down my drop-down menu. I'm going to select inches because I know this model was made in inches. So if you're going to be getting really into textures or lighting, or if you're just having some scale issues, sometimes it's a good idea to go ahead and select your model units. I'll hit OK. And so now this model, if I go under my scene tab, I know that this is going to be in inches. So really easily now I can just come over here. So we already have some materials that ship standard for Multec. So you just drag those over and then get a live preview of the material. But additionally, if I toggle back over to the website, you can see here there are many, many more materials that are available to you. So if you're interested in using these kind of pre-made materials, go ahead and bring those over, and then you can download those sets and bring them in. Okay, so here we can just drop these on, and as you can see, they should be accurate for a 5-inch part. So if I double-click those, I can come into the textures. So under the Textures tab, here are the different types of textures that you have available to you for a Multec plastic. So you can bring in a color texture, a bump, which is how this is actually supplying the texture that you see there, and then opacity. But when we go into all those different ones, let me start from scratch, basically. And then we'll go through basically the 4 different types of textures and how those are best used. So I'll just start a new session. I'll bring in that same cube, bring it in, place it in the middle, and then we'll start working with some textures. Okay, first of all, it's also important to know that you can have a lot of textures basically sitting around on your computer, you know, in project folders or in your pictures or wherever you keep them. But you can also import those into KeyShot. So we can handle those textures, and it's very, very easy to do so. So here in the Finder, I have a folder full of the textures. Most of these I'll try to get through today in our webinar. But I can bring these in really easily. I just come over here, I go under my textures, I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it My Textures, since those are the ones that we'll be working with. And I'm just going to select this import option. Now on my desktop, I'm going to go in here and find wherever I selected or wherever I have those textures. So here I've got this textures folder. And we handle basically any raster graphic, but PNGs, GIFs, TIFFs, those all come in. And additionally, anything with transparency will be supported. So I can just go ahead and select all of these, and open, and then I'll bring these textures in. So it's going to take a minute to actually scan all these over, give you a preview, but that way you can actually manage your library. This is especially good, additionally, if you're going to be using a single library for a team. So, for example, you could have your entire material library on a server, and you and your team or classmates or whoever it is, they can all have access to a common location on the server to store your textures or materials. But this way, when you do bring them over, they're stored either on that server, or let's say if it's just you, everything is managed in your KeyShot library, so you don't have to track down textures all over the place. Okay, so those textures came in. Additionally, we will get into some gradients today, so I'll make another directory, and I'm going to add those as well. Okay, and I'm going to import, and then I have an additional directory which gets into some color gradients. So I'll select those, import all of these as well. So same thing, once you import them, they're going to be in your KeyShot library. You don't have to worry about tracking them down later. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with this cube here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change this to a plastic. Plastic is a good building block for a material. There's a lot of stuff that you can base it off of. All of our materials in our material library are based off of the advanced material. So you can go in here, and starting with advanced, you can get almost any effect of the other materials with advanced. But for example, plastic, we don't have to see all the extra parameters that we're not going to be playing with. For example, on the base setting, we'll just get into the diffuse and the specular color, and then anything else will change with our textures. Okay, so right now my diffuse color is set to black. I'm just going to change that just to a gray. And our specular color right now is set to black. So specular is the reflectivity, or the colors that are reflected off the part. So if it's set to black, that means that it's not going to be reflective at all. If I set it to white, then it's going to reflect all colors. So I'll change out my environment so that you can see that a little bit better, because it's a little tough to see with the studio environment. But let's say if I drop that into an outdoor environment, and I zoom in here, you can see as I change my specular color, basically the reflectivity, not technically reflectivity, but the reflectivity will change, or the colors that get reflected. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and drop out my environment as a background by hitting C. That's just a quicker way of coming here to your environment tab and selecting color. So that's the shortcut to drop out the environment and bring in a color. So I hit C, and then that's going to just bring in that white background. So as far as textures go, I've got 4 available textures that I can choose with plastic. And I started with plastic because plastic allows you to drop in a specular texture. But I'll start over on the left. We have our color textures. So the color texture, or it's also called a diffuse texture, this is basically just going to replace your diffused color. So I can come over here to the textures that I brought in, and anything I select, I can just drag it over. I'll actually get a live preview as well. But when I do that, you can see what it'll look like basically with just the color dropped on. Additionally, when you do that hover, you can get an idea of what it'll look like if that texture is applied as a bump, a specular, or an opacity. Additionally, labels as well. I'm not going to go with that one, so I'll just hit escape. Oops, sorry about that. Didn't do it in time. But let me get rid of that, and then I'll drop on a different texture. But basically, our color textures are just, if let's say you're going to have a wood or brushed metal or plastic or anything like that, you can just bring in a color texture, and that's going to be your overall appearance for the material. So let's say I bring over this carbon fiber, and I drop that on, and I bring that in as a color texture. Then you have the appearance of carbon fiber on top of this plastic. As you can see, that plastic is still shiny because under my properties, I had my specular set to white. Okay, I'm going to disable that one. We're going to move over here to our specular tab, and I'll give you an idea of what the actual specular texture is. So instead of defining our specular color by changing it to black or white like we did on the first properties tab, we can choose a texture to actually define the specularity or the reflectivity of this part. So I'm going to drag this over, and I'm going to add that as a specular texture. And I'll zoom in here, and if you can see what that did, that actually makes it so that anything that's white in a specular texture is going to be 100% reflective. Anything that's black is going to be non-reflective. So you should be able to see that effect. But what it's doing in this case here, it's making that checkerboard pattern actually define the reflectivity. So if I go in and actually change this, I'll see if I can make, sorry about that. I can go in and make this a little shinier, I guess. I'll also turn up the brightness in the scene. You should be able to see that the black and white is reflecting my environment in different ways. So that's the basics of what a specular texture is. And KeyShot will respect the grayscale, so the values in between black and white will be differing levels of reflectivity. And I'll get into that with a little bit more complex texture. Additionally, I'll quickly move over here to a bump texture and then explain what that is and how it actually works. So a bump texture, I've got one here. I'll drag this over, and what a bump texture will actually do, it's going to use the values between black and white to actually define your shadows and highlights on the material. So you can see this, the material is actually staying the same, but I'm going to get different highlights and shadows based off of that texture. So I'm going to scale this up a little bit so you can see that a little bit better. But so this texture here isn't done at all with any sort of modeling. it's all based off of my 2D texture that I've applied. So we do have support for a bump map, which is a black and white image like the one that I'm using now. Additionally, we also take advantage of normal maps, which usually are this kind of you can see down here in my window, it's this kind of reddish purpley blue look. Those are a little bit more advanced, and I'm going to get into how we can actually make those. But they offer a lot more information as far as the depth of your texture. They have information for basically gradients between your X, Y, and Z values. So if I drop this over this normal map and I apply that as a bump map, you won't see much difference right now. But what I do is I go down here and I click normal map, and then this is going to be applied as a normal map. So KeyShot will automatically take any image that you apply as a bump map and try to turn it into a bump map. But if you do use a normal map, all you have to do is select that down here by checking that normal map function. This one is a little too tall, so you can always change that bump height to get a better look. Okay, and then quickly I'll just come over here to opacity, and then we'll get into opacity maps, and then we'll actually start making some real materials. But what an opacity map does, it respects black and white values, and it uses those to define the opacity of a material. So for example, we can find a repeating pattern like this, drop it over, apply it as an opacity map, and now you can see that the opacity of the part is defined by our texture that way. So instead of, for example, modeling this, which would be really complicated and make our cube much, much bigger in file size, it'd take a lot of time, and this way it'll save us a little bit of time as well. Additionally, this is a black on white. If I do invert this texture, or excuse me, invert the color, inverse color, you can see that now I have the opposite. Since it's black and white, it can easily change those, and so we can do basically add in the inverse value. So I'll drop that back to color, and then inverse color, and you can see the difference between those. Okay, great. All right, so we'll go in here and we'll actually start working on some textures. I'm going to go through some of just kind of the common requests that we do get. For example, one, stainless steel. We get the question, how do we get like a good brush stainless? So I'll show you one of the methods that we use for getting a good stainless. All right, so I changed my material type to metal. So that's just where I'm going to start. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring over a brush texture. So I have some that I generated here, and I actually generated these. So what we'll do is I'll try to make these available. I think we have an email list after the webinar, or we'll find a place to post these. So any texture that I generated that we can share, I'll share it online so you've got access to these as well. So I generated this using a piece of software called Filter Forge. So I'll give you a quick kind of overview of what that is and how it's used. But Filter Forge is an application that's used for generating textures, and this will generate color maps, bump maps, normal maps, and a lot of different things like that. So if I come in here to their website, you can get an idea of all the different types of filters. But what I did, I started here. I looked for a brushed metal, and I use this as my starting point, and this will open up in Filter Forge. And then here I can actually use this to generate new textures. So I've got mine saved. This will render in real time and give you an idea of what that texture will look like. But I use this to actually make this brushed metal here. So all it is in a pattern that is going to seamlessly tile, and it's going to be a random collection of scratches so that we can apply those as a texture to our material. Additionally, this is the type of thing that if you just hop online, you do have a ton of resources, free resources available to you. Filter Forge is an application that you can try it. You can get a free demo. You can pay for it if you like it. Additionally, you can always just go into Google and search for stainless texture, and that'll bring you a lot of different websites that have textures available to you. cgtextures.com is a great resource for finding textures. I'll actually pull it up just so you can. I can spell correctly, then it should pop up. So here you have a lot of different textures available, so this is a good resource. So keep this one in mind if you're ever looking for textures. They have quite a few available, and you can download them there. Additionally, I also recommend just kind of looking around. There are a lot of different rendering forums. I'm going to go ahead and recommend ours for sure. We have a great forum that we keep up. And here people share models, they share renderings, good tips, they share materials, textures, lighting environments. But for example, if we do scroll down here, we can go in and see our materials and textures thread. And so the first one is actually a great texture that Eduardo posted recently, but it does include the color map. It also includes a bump map, and I'll be using this one today. But this is for a metal weave pattern. And so online, there are a ton of resources that you can take advantage of. Our forum is a great one, so KeyShot.com/forum. But with some Googling, you can find all sorts of places where people are actually making textures that you can use. So I use FilterForge to basically create this brush, and this is the one that I'm going to actually bring over now, and we're going to make a brush stainless material. What I actually did is after I generated this, I brought it into Photoshop, added a little bit of noise. So I'll use, this is the brush linear that was created to start with, so I'll drag that over. And you can see that just as a color map. It's very, very faint. But what I did is I added a little bit of noise to it just to give it a little bit rougher appearance, and I'll drop that on now. And what I'll do is I'll come under here, my textures tab, and then I'll start playing with the scale. So I can drag that up. Additionally, we have a couple of different ways that you can actually map these textures. Let me change this to a less distracting environment, and I'll get into that component of it. I'll go to Studio. I'll try to find one that does not have as big hotspots to it. Okay, this will be a little bit better. Nope, not that much better. I'll just go with the startup for now. Okay, so you can see the textures here. Okay, the ways that you can actually map your textures, here you have this drop-down menu. So the basics are the planar X, Y, and Z. If I go under my View drop-down menu, I can always bring up the the coordinate legend. As you can see down here in the bottom left, that's going to show my coordinate system. So this is where my X, Y, and Z axes are. So if I change this, for example, from a box map to a planar X, then it's going to be projecting along the X axis. And so you can see it's coming from the right-hand side and then projecting along the X. If I change this to Y, it's going to be the same story coming along the Y axis, so you should be able to see that on top. And then Z, it's going to be coming over from the Z axis. So this is really helpful if you have a model that you need to project the different sides as a different material. For example, if you were doing some type of wood or packaging, you can define it so you can get away from the box map, which is the default, and have a little bit more control over how that's actually mapped out. UV coordinates, we're not going to go into that into too much detail today, but UV coordinates actually mapping that's defined by your 3D modeling software. So this is a little bit more complex, but that with UV mapping, you can have a whole lot of control over your mapping, but you do have to have a 3D modeling software that takes advantage of that. We'll go back to box map for now. And then as you can see, we just have a basic horizontal brush metal here. And to cut down on the reflectivity a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and increase the roughness, just so that it's not as reflective, so it doesn't have that as much of a chrome look to it. But I can change my scale here. I'm going to go ahead and increase this as well, just so you have a little bit more visible brush. Additionally, when you do have your box map, you can always hit the mapping tool. So what this allows you to do is actually adjust the position of your textures in real time. So you can drag any of these handles. This texture is seamless, not all of them are. So I can move this basically as much as I want, and I'll never have to worry about tiling. But this is how you can actually move those textures around in your scene. Additionally, I can scale here, so if I'm not happy with the scale that I selected previously, then I can adjust that scale. And then I just hit the little green check mark, and then whatever adjustments I made are going to be applied. Additionally, you do have some control over the brightness and contrast of your texture. So I brought this in, but depending on the scene that I'm in, let's say that stainless doesn't have enough pop to it, or it's too bright, I can adjust the brightness. So I can bring that down and make it a little bit more of a muted color. Additionally, if I wanted to make this brush vertical instead of horizontal, I just come in here, I type in 90, and then now that's going to be a vertical brush. And you can type in any angle or just use a slider to get a specific angle that you're looking for. So this is a pretty simple way to make a brush stainless. It does start with that texture, and like I mentioned, we'll try to make that texture available online as well. But basically what I would normally do is you just start with a metal, add on a brush texture, and then increase that roughness. And I'll put it in a little bit, let's say, shinier of an environment, so you can see how you can cut down on that reflection with the roughness. Okay. An additional request that we do get pretty often is carbon fiber, so I'll run through that as well. Let me go over here in the Textures tab, and I'll show you how this actual carbon fiber was created. So it actually started with a Photoshop file. So I'm going to move over here, and I'll show you the method that I use to make this carbon fiber texture. So I wanted a particular weave. We actually do include a carbon fiber texture with KeyShot. However, we got a customer request for something that was slightly different. So we assisted them in actually making that texture and making sure that it worked for them. So our carbon fiber was a little bit more of a checkerboard pattern, and I'm trying to put that now. But we wanted something that was a little bit more offset. And let me see if I can pull it up with my search tool. There we go. So it's a little tough to see on screen, but this is more of a checkerboard pattern as opposed to a little bit more of a weave. So the method I actually used to make this was I used a single repeating shape, and I'll just turn that on. This is one that I use. And basically what I started doing was I started layering these parts. And then when I had them all layered, I had two separate layers for my darker and my lighter weave. So you can see that there. And this effect was actually all done just through blending options. So if I right-click one of these parts, let's say this one here, I right-click it and I go into my blending options. All this texturing was actually added with a pattern overlay, for example, so to give it a little bit of roughness. And then I added a gradient overlay as well, and I'll adjust that. You can see the effect that it had in real time. So it gives it a little bit more depth. So all you need to make sure you, when you're working with creating a texture in Photoshop, it is a little bit of a challenge, but seamless tiling is when it gets to be really important. So what I had to do with creating this is start with the square pattern and then just keep in mind while I'm working of how I can actually keep this seamless. So if you zoom out, you can see that, for example, the corners are all sharing the same component. So this part here on the top left corner is the same as the bottom right. So that way I can actually just use this and create a repeating pattern. So this was all accomplished basically with one part that was duplicated. I added a stroke around it to give it a little bit of thickness, a gradient overlay, and then a pattern to give it that little subtle brush, or excuse me, the little subtle texture you can see there. So that's what I started with to create this texture. So we'll use that as our starting point. I'll come back in here. I'll double click my material to edit it. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the texture that we had previously on it. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to use plastic as a starting point. So I select this plastic out of my drop down. I'll change my diffuse color. I'll use the start off with black. And then I'm going to have my specular nice and bright. I'll keep that as a white. So we do have a reflective, basically a shiny black plastic. So now I can come over here into my textures, and I'm going to find the carbon fiber that I made. Originally, this file here is a PSD, so I flattened it and I exported it as a PNG. And so the PNG file is what I imported. So now I can just drag this over and apply that as a color map. So you can see here now I have a shiny carbon fiber texture. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the scale just so it's a little bit more visible. So now we've got that texture. I can change the angle on it, so rotate that a little bit. Let's go with a -30. So this is a type of pattern that you could see on, let's say, for example, a part on a race car or an airplane or something like that. And if I want to cut down on that reflectivity, I'm just going to drop down my specular color so that it's a little bit less reflective. Additionally, I can use the same carbon fiber texture and I can apply that as a bump map. So this wasn't intended to be a bump map, but with KeyShot we can basically take any image and apply it as it'll convert it basically to a bump map. So now you can see I'm going to get some more highlights in there, and that was just taking that image and dropping it over. But I'm going to get some highlights, and it's also going to be smart enough to identify where it's going to be placing the shadows as well. So you can create the illusion of depth using a color map as a bump map and just overlaying those. So it's really simple to actually get some really sophisticated results with not too much effort. This isn't any fancy modeling. It's all done with our mapping tools. Okay, so we've got this carbon fiber material. All right. And additionally, I can always use my mapping tool and define how that's going to be brought in. Again, this is a seamless texture, so this one doesn't really, this one doesn't matter how you actually place it onto the model. But we'll get to one that does. I'll use a non-repeating texture and try that out. Okay. All right, so something a little bit more complicated. Or we can start with a different basis. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these textures. And then I'm going to change this to a metal. And for example, this is a texture that was actually, this came from our forum. So I'm going to drag this one over on here, add this as a bump map. And sometimes when you get this effect where it's pushing it too hard, what you come down and do is you actually change that bump height. So one was too much, so now it's going to be a little bit more subtle of an effect. So this is a hammer tone texture. So on top of this, we can change our color. So I can change this to red. Well, it's still remembering my old color texture, so actually I'm going to bring in a color texture on top. So it's really easy to just combine those and bring them over onto that material. Additionally, let's say I didn't like this particular color for the color map that we had provided. You can always come in here and you can blend with color. So just check that box, and now you can colorize any color texture that you bring in here. I'll leave that off for now, and we'll keep that blue. Okay. So sometimes we could request, for example, if we can do a color gradient. Let me start a new session, and I'll bring in a part, and I'll show you how we can actually do that. So this you can do with textures as well. So I'll go ahead and just bring in this basic cube. And we have our part here, so I'm just going to go ahead and double click that. And so we'll set our diffuse color to, let's say, red. And if we wanted to actually add a color gradient to this part, there's no way you can do it in your modeling software and bring that over, but what we can do is use our textures to actually add a gradient. So, for example, let me find this blue. I can apply, this is a blue gradient that I created in Photoshop, so it goes from a solid blue to basically an alpha channel. So I'll drop this over as a color map, and you can see that's actually how we can get a gradient. I'm going to increase the scale, and I'll use my mapping tool to place this. And it looks like that won't be big enough, so I'll tweak that a little bit. But this way we can actually get a color gradient on our part. And I'll use my mapping tool again. And then this way, you've got a gradient. And then you can just go in here and change your material properties. So I can now change that to a metal. So I can actually have a metal with a color gradient on top. And then what I could do for my textures, and I'll do this with a little bit more complicated model, but with the mapping tool, I can define how this comes in. So for example, this is a cube projecting it with our box map, so it's applying it on all 6 sides. But if I wanted to apply this just coming from one direction, for example, I can use one of my planar tools and then apply that texture that way. Okay, all right. So that's how you can actually use gradients. And additionally, you can use a radial gradient, you can use a linear gradient, any kind of gradient that you can create in Photoshop. You can bring those in, and KeyShot is going to respect that. For example, here I'll bring in a radial gradient. So now you can see, use my mapping tool and kind of center that here. But you can bring in those color gradients, apply them that way. Another interesting application you can see is I'm going to go ahead and add a ground plane. So what this did, it adds a plane down at the bottom, and what that does is sometimes helps with shadows. It'll collect shadows a little bit better than just using your environment shadows. But I'm going to drop a pattern on this. Let me find one. Let's say I use this bump texture. So I drag that over, apply it as a bump, and then my ground, I'll come in here, I'll increase the scale on this. So we can see this texture a little better. So as this reses up, you can see that that bump texture is now applied to the ground. But one cool effect that I saw and I wanted to try to actually replicate was they had the ground actually fading into nothing, which I thought was really neat. What you can actually do is you can apply an opacity map to help with fades from a visible texture to basically something invisible. So I'm just have a radial texture here that I'm going to drag over onto my ground. I'm going to apply that as an opacity map. So you can get that live preview here, and what you're actually going to see is you're going to see the ground basically blending into the background. So here it's really small, but I'm going to increase my scale. Let's go with something like 8. I'll bump that up a little bit more. So now my cube is sitting on this circle here, which is going to fade into white. I'm going to turn off the repeat. And so now when you're looking at this, you can take advantage of those opacity maps to get a look like this, where your ground texture is fading into nothing. So for example, if you wanted to place this on a grid pattern, anything like a ground, that's completely up to you. You can use any texture. And then if you were going to put this into a presentation or a presentation board, it's easy to kind of have it fade onto white. So this is another pretty cool look that I saw, and we can really easily do this type of look here as well. Okay. So let me, I think I've covered most of the basics. We've gone through specular maps, bump maps, normal maps, opacity maps, and color maps. So I'm going to go ahead and start actually painting up a model. So let me see what we've got here. We've got some steampunk goggles. So these were, this was a model that I got on TurboSquid. We have a partnership with TurboSquid. So if you're ever looking for 3D models that you just need to, say, populate a scene, for example, TurboSquid now will actually verify models and make sure that they work with KeyShot, which is fantastic. So you know that when they come in, they're going to have, you can assign materials. A lot of them have some advanced mapping options like UV mapping, for example. You can download those and then use them. So I'm just going to open this file, which I'd opened previously. So it comes in. In here we have some funky steampunk goggles. Okay, I'm going to go into performance mode while I'm actually painting this up. So you get into performance mode to actually speed up the performance. What it does, it turns off the shadowing, it turns down the ray tracing. So it's a little bit faster, especially with a really complicated model. This one does have a lot of parts, so it's easier to throw the model around and actually do some painting. So let's start here. I'm just going to go ahead and create a basic leather. So I'll double click on my part. So that's going to bring open the material tab. I'm going to change this to a plastic. I mentioned before, plastic is a good starting point for a lot of materials. So I'll keep that gray for now, and then we're going to change the specular, and we're going to make this into kind of a shiny plastic. What we're going to do is actually start with leather. So I have a leather that I actually found online. If I can remember where I found it, I'll also post the link when we post the other textures that I created. But sometimes it's just as simple as actually Googling these and you can find a texture. So I've got this leather normal map, which I'm just going to drag over to my part. Again, you get that live preview, and I'm going to drop this in as a bump map. But since this is actually a normal map, and you can tell because it's got kind of that purpley appearance, I'll go under my textures tab, and down at the bottom, I'm going to select normal map. And that's going to give me a better appearance. So this is actually going to better understand what's going on with that texture. So always remember, if you're using a normal map, the kind of purple ones, make sure to check that down here. I'm going to scale this up just a little bit. Oops, too much. So we now have a good leather grain, and I'm going to change this to, let's say we'll use like a gray color, but we'll use a little bit darker one. Up. Not sure why it's not letting me change that color. Sorry about that. Apply that as my color map. Additionally, I can come in and we can just try. Come in here. I'm going to go ahead and blend that just to make it a dark gray. Okay. I think I found a small bug with this texture, this particular texture that I use. Not sure why it's not allowing me to change the color on it. But we'll keep that for now, and we'll just continue using this as my basis for my leather parts. So you can always copy and paste the material, hold down Shift, left click to copy, and then Shift, right click to paste. So it's going to paste that material. So I'm going to paste it on these parts as well. These are linked, so I have my leather painted up, and these are going to be some crazy looking goggles. So these inserts here, I'm assuming those are just rubber, so I'll go under my materials tab and just type in rubber. So we do have a great rubber that's already in our library, so it's going to paint these up. And then I'm going to go ahead and start working with some of these metals. So steampunk is kind of about faded or rusty or scratched up metals. So I'm going to create one here. So I have some textures that I can use. For example, this derelict texture. So this was actually one that I generated previously in Filter Forge, so I can drag that on. So if I drag this over here, and then apply this to the material, and apply that as color texture, and I'm going to change that to a metal. I was working on the wrong part. Change this to a metal, and then so we'll get a little bit of some sheen to it. Additionally, I can go in, and this texture actually came with a normal map. So I can drag this over here, and then you'll see that live preview. It's going to come in as a bump map. Double click that. Make sure that I'm using the bump or this normal map as a normal map. And so now when I zoom in here, you'll see that's going to give me a little bit of three-dimensionality to this texture. I'll decrease it a little bit so it's not as kind of dense. But now you can see these little faded parts or the rust components that are going to catch more highlights and show some more shadows. And these are some really beat up goggles. So let me increase the scale on those so it's not as visible. Okay, so Shift left click, Shift right click, I can assign those this material to some other parts. Additionally, I'll go ahead and let me see if I have, we should have a copper in our existing material library. Just use a copper that's got a little bit of brush to, or excuse me, a little bit of roughness to it already. But what I want to do is I want to add some scratches to this so it looks a little bit beaten up. So I'm going to work directly on this part. So I'll right click, I'll say look at it, and that's going to actually put this part here as my axis of rotation for the camera and as the focal point. So if I double click that, I can edit this. And what I'll do is I'll bring over one of my textures that I imported
previously, and then just apply this here. So I've got one that has some scratches. So just drag this over, apply that, and then bring this in as a bump texture. So this is just going to be some scratches. It looks really dense. So what I'm going to do